All right, thank you, boys. We are back with our Seeing Through Gebser, the ever-present origin. Today we will be doing a short digression on the unity of primal words. So we're going to be talking a lot about etymology, which before I read this book, I did not see any use in etymology at all. It was like, who cares what words mean, especially after my layman's understanding of Wittgenstein, but we'll get to that. First, I want to thank you guys for engaging with me more in the comments section and in my videos. I really appreciate that. That's the whole reason I started doing this, to get some ideas out there. And even those who are critical of me, you guys have been pretty respectful and pretty nice. And please don't ever, if you think I'm saying something wrong or stupid, just let me know. I prefer maybe a little more specific critiques, but take what I can get. So I do want to thank you guys so much for the engagement. It really does mean a lot. I know I don't have a ton of subscribers. I know my videos aren't the highest of production value and all that stuff, but I just wanted to thank you guys because it's really kind. It means a lot. Even if you are being critical of me, it means a lot. So let's get right into it. I should have enough time today. We have a digression on the unity of primal words. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the word digression is used. Everything in this book, besides maybe some footnotes or just a list of references, which even then you should probably check out, you need to read. All right, we don't skip things in Gebser. We don't. Now, in nonfiction, you can skip things, right? If you're trying to learn and you get to a point where things are like, what does this have to do with anything? I'm not going to use this ever. Yeah, just skip it. That's good advice out there. You don't do that in fiction, but in nonfiction, if you get caught on an aspect or a part of a book that you think is useless and you're not going to use it all, just skip it. Don't throw the book out. Just skip it. There you go. That doesn't apply to Gebser. Gebser is the man, so you will read all of the man's words. So a digression on the unity of primal words, it's not really a digression. It's important and necessary. So if you get to this part in the book, don't skip it. Don't skip any digressions. Don't skip anything. Study Gebser and take the time to do it because it is infinitely rewarding. Now, let's get into it. Now it says a digression on the unity of primal words. So we're going to be analyzing the earliest words that our species had created and spoken and used for social functioning. And it also says the unity of primal words. Pop quiz, unity. What consciousness structure does that sort of correspond to? The magic structure. Well done. I know you got that right. I can tell through my magic consciousness structure. I have deployed telepathy to know that you got that right. So well done. You get 3 gold stars. Well done. So let's get into it. So we're going to be talking about exactly that. Primal words, their meanings, how they were used, and how they were used differently throughout the progression and unfolding of the consciousness structures. Preemptively, you have to understand, rationally speaking, A is A, and A cannot be A and B at the same time. That is not, as this series has shown, there are more aspects to the human condition than just that. So we will be tossing that aside for a second. Now let's get into it. Quote, excuse me. We have already pointed out above, page 1 to 2, that we intend to draw particularly on linguistic evidence to elucidate our inquiry. Speech or language is not only fundamental to the life of every individual, it is also a compelling and linking factor. So you should have more respect for communication and words because you use them every day. And on an individual level, but of course, through societal functioning, we can't do anything. It's one of the big things that separates us from the animals, our supple language. Even someone like Yuval Noah Harari in Sapiens, this is an infinitely better book than Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. You're going to have to study it more, but it does the same thing, just accomplishes far more. Even he said our supple language is one of the key factors that cause our species to evolve to greater heights than other animals. They could not communicate so freely as we did. Communication, one, it's more conducive towards evolutionary success. We can now plan and strategize, and we can say, hey, a bear is coming, do something about it, rather than just kind of being enslaved to the whims of that bear. And 2, gossip actually is a way of forming social structures, forming the bond. Gossip is a key evolutionary facet or aspect that was more conducive to our success. Quote, the success of our exposition will depend to a considerable extent on how we approach and incorporate language into our discussion. This is particularly true of our attempt to present and describe new circumstances and conditions by means of traditional language. So we're trying to find, it's like that Nietzsche quote. He who is original is not who discovers what is new, but who discovers the old as new, who sees the old as something new. That's what Gebser's doing. The present work is concerned with new or at least novel actualities. Because of this, we do not restrict ourselves to treating a clearly circumscribed thesis with rationally placed subdivisions and consequently invariable and predetermined terminology, in order to reveal an integral structure in which the pre-rational and irrational elements have a role equal to the rational. It is essential for us to maintain an attitude toward language cognizant of its wholeness. We're not just doing the rationalists. This word has one meaning, this sentence has one meaning. No. Just as every person represents and lives the entire mutational series of mankind through his structures, so too each word reflects its mutational exfoliation within language itself. We'll pick up on this. We have refrained from the common practice of imputing to words, particularly to our key words, a mental or rational connotation with a rigid and unilateral definition. No, we do not have just one definition. A is not just A. It can be rationally speaking. It must be rationally speaking. But again, read history. We're not just rational robots. We are trying to understand the use of language and the use of these words on their own terms, not mentally and rationally going backwards and saying, no, this is contradictory. Wrath means blind anger. That's what wrath means. No, that's your limited way of viewing words and etymology, and I refuse to play by your limited game. Rather, we have endeavored to ascertain what the word itself denotes and articulates, kind of like a Wittgenstein attempt. We have, in other words, now restricted our understanding to the gradually obdurate conceptual meaning in each instance as if it were the word's only valid sense. This procedure will undoubtedly offend some, particularly those who believe they can function entirely within the confines of the quote-unquote rational structure and their pursuit of scientific quote-unquote objectivity, oblivious to the limitations imposed by their objectivation of their own vital and psychic makeup. I love when Gebser attacks rationalist. You are limited. I refuse to play your limited game. No. This does not necessarily place our procedure into a value opposition over against contemporary modes of inquiry. We merely wish to indicate how and why our procedure must differ. The task that has posed itself to us of revealing the world as an entirety necessarily differs from that of the exclusive rationalist who divides and subdivides. Indeed, is compelled to do so in order to obtain his specialized and partial results. So there you go. This is why we're not using rationality, because we're trying to figure out the whole, the entirety, and of course the mental consciousness structure video that you should watch. As I explained, rationality sectors off apart from the whole, and rationalism transposes the whole onto the part. That is to say, pretends the part is the whole. You shouldn't always do that. You don't necessarily have to do that. And to understand the consciousness structures on their own terms, you cannot deploy purely rational terms. It just doesn't make sense. Like a purely rational approach with its weakness and limitations, ours too has its shortcomings, limitations, and, above all, temporal restrictions in the form of temporal boundaries. It is this very fact of temporal boundaries that induces us to begin our discussion of language with a temporic moment. We must let the words, at least those central to our discussion, reveal whatever temporal aspect holds. This temporal aspect resides in the primordial meaning of the word root, which even today gives the word in latent and potential form its distinctive stamp. It is the original meaning that is still luminous throughout the unfolding changes of meaning taken on or attributed over the years. So two things. One, we're going to use time and epochs to help guide us through this. So if we know the perspectival phase and we know the pre-perspectival phase, well, how are these words being used outside of those epochs? In the magical epoch, in the mythical epoch, in the integral epoch. So we're using temporal boundaries to guide us, but we should also make sure not to let those temporal boundaries restrict us into thinking these are the only things that exist. There's almost an evolution of meaning of these words that he's getting at. Let's see. Every word, here it is, every word, after all, is not only a concept or a fixed equivalent in writing, it is also an image and thus mythical, so a concept or a fixed equivalent in writing, rational. It is also an image and thus mythical, a sound and thus magic, a root and thus archaic, and thus, by virtue of this root meaning, still present from origin. So there you go. These words have different they take on different meanings depending on which consciousness structure is using them. And these words express all different consciousness structures. So as it's just said, archaic, there's a magical, mythical, and then mental. So interesting stuff. Okay, so he says we must, in other words, go back to the word roots as we have been doing and listen to those words that belong together. We must complement these with others that seem to correspond to each other until an image appears. We must allow ourselves to be directed by the criteria imposed on us by our thinking, or which we impose on it. Then we can be certain that we remain within the respective framework of the data of each individual structure, and that these data, viewed from our present mental standpoint, are effectual. So we're going to be examining the word roots. The roots, so we have the primordial word, right? So words that were used all the way back in 30,000 BC, or the magical structure. Okay, well, what is the root meaning of those words? It's difficult to ascertain because, as already noted, the magical structure isn't conducive towards historical documentation. Nonetheless, Gebser is going to try to figure it out. Let's see. Now, he does a lot of sort of throat clearing about why he's deploying his process of doing this. It is interesting, and it's somewhat interesting. If you guys are really interested, I could leave something in the comments. It might take up a little time. So we're going to skip all that, but he basically goes through all the deficient ways of viewing etymology and these words, the root meaning of these words, and he justifies his approach. It's interesting, but maybe not worth it. Quote, he says, yes, we must not assume that the discovery of irrational and pre-rational context necessarily leads to irrationalism. Every attempt to recover the roots summons forth in us at least one defense. Their obscurity and unfathomability run counter to the mental attitude, and the very proximity of the non-rational structures tends to activate negatively pre-rational affective emotional responses. So the magic and mythical structures are arguably even the archaic. When we go back to try to attribute sense to the senseless in these sort of primordial word meanings, it's very important. I've critiqued rationalism a fair bit on this channel, but you also don't want to go back into irrationalism to the point where anything that is irrationally true is true. Of course, that's almost goes without saying. So you have to find a balance between the irrational or the pre-rational and the pre-rational and the rational if you want to do this. Remember, we're being integral here. We're not just using rational, but we're also not tossing it out entirely. But we're also not being exclusively irrational. We must find this balance and make sure that in our attempt to attribute sense to the senseless, we do not become senseless ourselves. Quote, this is particularly true unless we are able to some degree to view these matters from the a-perspectival vantage point alluded to, though not elaborated, again, second half of the book, earlier, thereby protecting ourselves from sliding into a pre-rational or irrational stances rather than to attempt to rise above them, particularly as the rational attitude cannot do this of itself. He says, in spite of these complications, let us turn our attention to the task of examining roots, which even today show the greatest vitality in the primal words. I forgot to mention this. He says, so we have the sort of the magical interpretation, the mythical, the mental, but also the common through lines of meaning between the magical use of the word, the mythical use of the word, and the mental use of the word. If you see a common conception as a through line between these, that really tells you what the word means. So if you use the term like character, that's in many ways our use of the term character is in a rational sense is very similar to the use of the term character that the ancient Greeks had or someone else. So it's important you can find these concepts and these ideas in the through line, in the consistency held through these use of these words. Carl Abel, in his monumental study cited earlier, has demonstrated that these primal words are quote-unquote contrary in sense, prompting Sigmund Freud to speak of them in his review of Abel, also cited above, as being quote-unquote antithetical. To us, it would seem that this definition, while not inappropriate, is at least one-sided. Guess what one-sided it's towards? It is valid only if we are content to describe the phenomenon of primal words in mental rational terms. The words contrary in sense clearly demonstrate the purely rationalistic attitude of its author, both in the contrary and this sense, which in this instance clearly reflects the sense of direction inherent in the word sense, as we noted earlier. So, of course, if you hear contrary in sense, contrary or contradictory, that's rational, staple of rational thought. Sense, as we discovered earlier with the etymological connections of sense and direction, direction being a hallmark of mental thought, rational thought. Yeah, we've got some mental rational. So what happened here? But Carl Abel, who I won't lie to you, I don't know who that is, and Sigmund Freud said the roots, the meaning of the root words were contradictory in sense. Remember, that's only one way of viewing it, the mythical way of viewing it. They are not contradictory. They are polar complements. There is nothing to reconcile. They're self-sustaining. They exist on their own. And of course, in magic, it's unity. There too is no contradictory because unity subsumes all, and all presupposes opposites. There's no contradictory in the unperspectable world. The magical structure and the mythical structure didn't happen. But in dealing with primal words, as with all primal phenomena, it makes no sense, to speak of antithesis and direction unless we were to content ourselves, contrary to our human inclinations, with explaining only the rational sector of our world and dispensing with the presentation of the whole. To the extent that all primal phenomena are manifest in and belong predominantly to the efficient phase of the magic structure where the emphasis lies on the magic unity and not on conceptual antithesis or mythical complementarity, we must define a rational conception of the contradictoriness of primal words as their unity. This is the temporal boundaries that he's getting. All primal phenomena are manifest in the efficient phase of the magic structure, and that is what? Unity. So even mythical polarity and complementarity and correspondence is not really there in the sense of the meaning of root words, the root meaning of primordial words. This is before 10,000 BC. This is before the mythical consciousness structure mutated. So we have archaic and we have magic, and that is it. We are an efficient magic. So the contradictoriness of the original meaning of root word, the root meaning of primordial words, is not contradictory. Remember, it's unitary. It is wholeness. We talked about this in the magical consciousness structure. That's the way objects in the world are brought into relation with each other. So it makes sense that they use words in that way. And the same thing with the mythical. We'll get there. But right now, the unity, I digression on the unity of primal words, magic. The primal words, which are primal phenomena, belong to the magic consciousness structure. Therefore, you should expect that anything out of that is expressing a unity. There is no contradictory, there is no opposites, there is no even polar correspondence. Unitary, magic. We speak here of unity because it is one syllable, one root, or one word family that expresses something non-antithetical, and unitary, which only later is polarized and even later still undergoes a modification by our thinking into later still undergoes a modification by our thinking into an antithesis. The beginning of the process that leads to polarity and antithesis presumably occurs as early as the deficient phase of the magic structure, or at least has its preparatory stages there. At the outset, the primal words testify to the very directionless, quote-unquote, senseless undifferentiation which we find characteristic of the magic structure. And it is not true, as Abel apparently maintains, if we are to judge on the basis of Freud's review, that the positive or negative meaning or sense was conveyed via signs or gestures accompanying their utterance. Rather, this sense was expressed in any event before the Egyptian and Greek periods by lengthening or shortening the stem vowel, that is, by a phonic distinction. So, if these words are expressing a unity of concepts, and rationally speaking, the unity is divided into subdivisions that are distinct and different from one another, how do I know which aspect of the unity, which part of the whole you are referencing? Abel seems to think that in addition to communicating, there were certain gestures that we did, probably with our hands or something, that made clear which part of the whole of the unity of the word I'm expressing that I'm referencing. That is not true, as Gebser says. It has to do with shortening the stem vowel. A stem vowel is the vowel that is part of the base form of a word called the stem, before any changes or additions are made to it. like adding endings or changing its form. It is the vowel that can change when the word is modified, particularly important in verb conjugations where the stem vowel can shift depending on the tense or person being used. Key points about stem vowels. Function. It is the vowel that precedes any inflection endings on a word stem. Example, in the verb sing, the stem vowel is I. When you change it to sang, past tense, the stem vowel changes to an A. So that same change from sing to sang, the I is the stem vowel, and that's changed. So you change the stem vowel to gesture at which particular part of the unified whole that you are expressing. Hopefully that made sense. It's a phonic distinction, not some hand gestures or whatever. The root mu, on which the word myth is based, we already covered this in the mythical structure video, can serve as a representative example with its vowel pronounced long or short, thereby giving rise to its later antithetical meaning. For it is this auditory aspect, not the imagistic or pictographic, which we will have to attribute to the initial phenomena if we are to remain consistent with the results of our findings. In the beginnings, the magic structure is definitively auditory. The ear is the magic sensor, not the eye with its images and signs. Sonority and music, not image or sign, are the inceptual and coincident manifestational and realizational forms of the magic structure, where they still form a unity. So the sense that was privileged in the magic structure is the ear, which of course audible, right? I'm hearing. My sense of hearing is differentiated to the point where I can pick up on subtle phonetic nuances where I can ascertain in the unity of the word expressed, this is what you're specifically referencing. Now, this is interesting. I made a reference to this in one of my other videos. Nowhere is timelessness more evident than during those moments when we abandon ourselves to the power of music, becoming nearly as timeless as Magic Man. So, of course, timelessness was also a key aspect of the magic structure, and I think you can feel that timelessness as long as you get lost in a really great piece of music. You're almost not even in a world or particular time or place. You're just there enjoying this music. I thought that was interesting. Magic Man, however, had a keener and more nuanced sense of hearing, and languages such as Chinese that are less rationalistic and therefore closer to the magic realm than the European tongues are distinct in their phonetic nuances, which are able to confer completely different meanings on otherwise identical stem syllables or phonemes. The meaning of a particular word in Chinese, for example, is determined by the pronunciation of the stem vowel. A lengthened or shortened vowel, a rising or falling intonation, conveys in each instance a different meaning. So there you go. Chinese is a good example. It's less rationalistic, which means it's more connected to the magical structure's use of words, and you can hear these phonetic different. Now, I don't speak a lick of Chinese, so I wouldn't be able to do this, but they are able to pick up the subtle nuances because the ear is still differentiated. That's magic structure, baby. Let's see. Okay. It is this primordiality of hearing that enables us to find an adequate definition for the phenomena of primal words. Perhaps the auditory sense is not the first from a physiological standpoint, but is definitely more prominent in the magic realm than the visual sense. Or, to be more exact, both were undifferentiated, and to the extent that the eye reacted, it was more receptive to the tone colors and what it perceived, as is evident in the aura depictions, which show in the original a relatively greater differentiation of colors than of contours. Speaking of the age before the influence of the earliest founders of religion, Kreuzer observes that, quote, auditory symbolism was not yet distinguished from visual symbolism. Remember the lack of differentiation in the magic structure. He senses, in other words, the still evident undifferentiation of eye and ear, at least with respect to what we have called the efficient phase of magic. Indeed, this lack of differentiation is valid for the structure in general, particularly as the sharp contours of the prehistoric cave paintings were presumably executed only toward the close of the deficient phase of the magic structure. Now that I'm rereading this is kind of interesting because he's saying the eye and the ear were not differentiated, but yet he's saying that the ear could understand these phonetic differences. I might have to pick up on that later. I'm not sure. Maybe that's a contradiction, or maybe that's just unity, depending how you want to look at it. Yet even today in our intellectualized languages, there are word pairs which manifest the polarity or ambivalence of the primal syllable that in itself expresses and represents a unity. An instance of this, is the word pair that formed the point of departure for this digression. Measure and mass, or mass and mass. That'll be the next video. They bear the same relationship to each other as the words weg, way, and weg, away. and musing, and mus, compunction, cited earlier. In all three instances, the lengthening or shortening of the stem vowel echoes the ambivalence of what was once an undifferentiated unity. We changed the stem vowel, and now we're, as you said, echoes the ambivalence. Ambivalence meaning that there's contradictory, the different aspects of the unit, the different parts of the whole. That's what we do when we separate, or when we change the stem vowel of word. Now, this is interesting. I was going to skip over this, but I think you're about to hear some bad pronunciations, but some of the connections he makes are just unbelievable. This is also true of yet another word pair, which has a signal role in our discussion, particularly as we are concerned throughout with the question of consciousness and, of course, the unconscious. The pair hole, cavern, and hell, brightness. Both words derive from the Indo-Germanic root kel, to which are related from earlier times the Latin words clam, secretly, and clamere, to scream, as well as the German words hellen, to conceal, hal, hall, hole, hollow, hull, cloak shell, and hulse, hull, husk, among others. I would never be able to do that. I don't know how to make those connections. This is why Gebser is the genius. The root of the word pair measure and mass is ma-mi, a configuration at the basis of the mental structure. From this root, it should be evident that at the outset, primal words are neither contradictory nor ambivalent, but rather became so. Their unity became polarized and later antithetical. Again, they started as primordial phenomena in the magic, they became polarized and complementary in the mythical, then they became antithetical in that one single idea, and there you go. So there's almost an evolution that resembles the evolution of consciousness. We must not overlook the effects of this cleavage in our attempt at an integral mode of understanding and presentation. Sometimes he says presentation and presentation, so I don't know. For it is in effect a dimensioning of the primal words. The initial unitary and later polar nature unique to these words can no more be rationalized away than man's instinct, emotion, and imagination can be explained away without denying and destroying man's very humanity. Based. Thank you. Rational analysis, it is true, can explain some things, but it is powerless to come to terms with phenomena such as unity or polarity. Moreover, our concern here is with the clarification, not with explanation. Based. So you're not going to rationalize away the magic and mythical interpretations of the meaning of these words, and you shouldn't, because we're in 2025, we're doing that. So no one takes mythology seriously. No one takes any of, as you said, instinct, emotion, or imagination. None of that's taken seriously, and that's a huge problem. So we're not going to repeat that problem when it comes to analyzing etymological meanings. Let's see. There are relatively few word pairs. There's a bunch, by the way, of examples of etymology. I'm not going to make all of them because that would expand this video beyond what it needs to be, but there's some good stuff in there. There are relatively few word pairs, such as those cited, mass, weg, moose, and whole, hell, that illustrate the initial unity, which is later polarized and ultimately rigidified as an antithesis. And those that are extant are difficult to locate since we have only etymological dictionaries which trace the modern words back to their Indo-European roots. What is lacking are dictionaries which we should like to call root dictionaries, in which the development of or exfoliation of the roots throughout the various language is recorded. So what we need is essentially a Gebserian dictionary and not this rational nonsense where we assign the words one meaning and then we work backwards and shove everything into our rational box that doesn't fit. No. A dictionary such as this would have to consider what we shall call the mirror root. By this, we mean the inversion of the root sounds that express the other side of the basic meanings. This is what I was getting at after the parts and the whole, or earlier, excuse me. As an example of this, we would like to describe how we came to discover the mirror root in connection with the pair whole, hellen, and hell. Whole is H-O-H-L-E, and hellen is H-E-L-L-E. We had been preoccupied for some time with the likely root kinship of the words logos, light, and lie. Remember now, if you think these ideas are different, we're expressing unity. Distinction is not in the wheelhouse yet. So words logos, light, and lie, untruth. Now the Indo-Germanic root of logos is leg, L-E-G. That of light is lek, and that of lie is presumably the same root, leg, lek. But this is of course merely the inversion of the root kel. In other words, in the mirror sound, where everything is reversed, obscurity and concealment become light. That is, when inverted, darkness, kel, darkness is leg. Lek stands for light, and kel is darkness. So to express the particular aspect of the unified whole, the particular part, if I'm gesturing at light, I would say lek, but if I were to simply invert it, it's kel. You can see how this expresses a unitary rather than a polar existence, I guess, rather than a rational. So we're going to read that again. We have now the Indo-Germanic root of logos is leg, that of light is lek, and that of lie is presumably the same root, leg, lek. But this is, of course, merely the inversion of the root kel, in other words, in the mirror sound, where everything is reversed. Obscurity and concealment become light, that is, when inverted, kel, darkness, is leg. So we change which vowels or which root we want to use, and in doing so, we make clear the inverted or the mirror meaning. So if I'm referencing light, I'm doing lek. That's what I mean. But of course, this is just an inversion of kel, which is darkness. So there is a root, complementary, and unified meaning, and I will change which vowels or which root I will deploy when I'm speaking to make clear which aspect of the whole or which part of the meaning I'm referencing. The effect of this law of mirroring inherent in the unity of the roots is consistent with what we have called the speculatio anime. Whatever is quote-unquote inside becomes visible quote-unquote outside in the mirror image. One meaning is expressed directly in the word, while there is an additional latent and unexpressed inner meaning that is directly expressed as a complementary and thus unitary, rather than antithetical meaning. The mirror thus renders this complementary meaning expressible and audible. So again, you are seeing the complementarity there. We have the root word. I just explained it. You got it. Let me see if there's anything else I want to add here on this. So that should be enough to get you out of this rational box that no, light, it means light, and darkness means darkness, and there's no inversion or complement. No, that's rationale. That's rationalism. That's not understanding how these words were used on their own, and that's limited. We're not going to do that. Now he says, finally, let us mention the more familiar form of that unity of primal words, which is evident in the antitheticality, of our intellectualized European languages. For instance, in the word cold, which has caldo in Italian and chaud in French means hot and not cold. Okay, so cold, in other words, means hot. This interplay, emphasizing in the one language now the one, and another language now the other or contrary aspect of the once unitary signification, is more frequently than commonly realized. So one language, English, says cold is, I'm shivering, it's cold outside. But now that we have different languages, and now that things are getting all interplayed and mixed up throughout history, you're seeing the unitary and corresponding and complementary meaning of cold and hot. These are two halves of one, meaning temperature or whatever. In other languages, cold is hot. The root word of cold is hot, but of course here, cold just means cold. No, cold means cold in a rational sense, but if we go back, these words expressed a unity or a complementarity, so hot and cold, coming or deriving from the same root word, actually makes complete sense, because they are expressions of either the magical or mythical consciousness structure. So, interesting stuff. Among the implications which urge themselves on us from this consideration of the unity of primal words, one is preeminent. Within the medium which we must employ to present the whole or the integral, that is, within language, we can discern integral echoes which emerge from quote-unquote behind the unity of primal words and restore to language the integral character indispensable to the success of any attempt to represent this integrality. A further implication, resulting primarily from the auditory predisposition of the magic structure, can be found in our ability to find in language itself some enlightenment about certain primordial interrelationships if we are willing to listen to language and respond to it in the same degree that we believe it to be under our command. Some words manifest an identity, magic, some others a correspondence, others a complementary an image, so others establish a logical antithetical relation to each other. Consequently, this is interesting. It's no accident that we speak of a plea or a prayer being quote unquote heard by something or someone able to answer it. My prayers were heard. The bus came on time. This auditory process shows that it too, like everything else connected with this form of utterance, has a magic character. My prayers were heard. I prayed, and then those prayers connected to the unity of the world. And then because I prayed, I gained power of the magical forces, and then the bus came on time, so to speak. Nor is it accidental that wishes are fulfilled. Fulfillment requires something that can be closed or completed, such as a circle or the psyche that responds to a wish. Mythical structure, baby. And the fact that we speak of ideals as ideal images and wishful thinking and pipe dreams or wish dreams, and even equate the notion of dream with wishes, dream home, shows the degree to which all aspects of wishfulness correspond to our psychic mythical structure with its imagistic and dream-like character. Interesting. So we have pipe dreams, wishful thinking, and a dream home. Now, what he's doing is he's noticing the connections between the meanings of the root meanings of primordial words and how they're used. So if we can notice these connections that the people at the time made with certain words and certain concepts, we can have a greater understanding of not only what they thought, but what aspects of the world and the human condition belong to what. So like he said, nor is it accidental that wishes are fulfilled. Fulfilled requires something that can be closed or completed. So that's a reference to the mythical, right? And the mythical is based on the soul or the psyche. So wishes and dreams, that's an aspect of the psyche. So when you hear things like it's my dream home or it's a pipe dream, that's not corresponding to any sort of rational mental thing. That's corresponding to the internal, the psyche. So if you can pick up on stuff like that, you can have a great understanding of what's really going on here. And it is surely no coincidence that the language relates the word will, and it is surely no coincidence that language relates the word will or volition with attaining a goal, rather than with being heard or fulfilled, since such goal orientation definitively relegates it to the mental structure. There you go. Let's see. If we consider these primordial interconnections, recalling the close kinship between the words think and thank, as well as live and love, our suggestion that we attend to language will bring about a greater wakefulness than mere attention. For a discussion of the expressive force of the number 8, which occurs in the words for attend and attenten, I should have read that. It will result in the supra-wakeful diaphany to which not only what is past, but perhaps also what is yet to come could be present. Let us conclude this digression with the sole example of a primal word still intact in modern German, the word all, whose importance for the archaic structure is evident in the previous cross-sections. The word in everyday speech, which is less intellectualized than formal writing, presents us with the pure primal word and its expression of unity or identity without any modification of vowel or vowel quantity. So there's no, just like lek and kel, you're not changing any stem vowels or anything like that. You're not inverting the roots. You're not doing any of that. With all, it's just all. And it expresses that unity. It encompasses all, even that which we can't rationally account for. This word, which denotes the most encompassing existence of everything, can at the same time mean utter non-existence, since when we're speaking of something we look for and find used up, we say it is all gone. So there's the unity right there. All can mean all that is existing, but it also means all that doesn't exist. So it is truly all encompassing. So that is our digression on the unity of primal words. I want to make sure and go back to that Kel and make sure. Yeah, so just make clear, the leg or the lek and the kel, these derive from the same root, and I will invert. If I'm talking about darkness or if I'm talking about lightness, that will depend. If I mean light, I'm going to use lek. If I mean darkness, I'm going to use kel. But of course, these are inversion, and that inverted quality reveals the polar and unitary meaning of these words. So mental rational accounting of this, it can be good, okay? It can be good, especially when we're thinking rationally. But it's not sufficient to understand how words were used on their own terms throughout history. So I hope you guys learned something. I hope you had a little bit more respect or gained a little bit more respect for etymology, because Lord knows I did. I took the Wittgenstein approach, and now this is my layman understanding of Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein says, look, there is no essential meaning of any word. Really, words are used to express whatever meaning. It's a purely practical. We can call this a computer mouse. We can call this whatever we want. It's just a signifier meant to signify a certain idea, concept, idea, entity, whatever. So Wittgenstein says there is no set, rigid, unquestionable meaning of a word. We deploy a word to mean something within a particular context. So words in the East Coast of America might be completely different than words on the West Coast of America, or a word spoken by the Crips or the Bloods might have a different meaning than the words spoken by hipsters in Massachusetts. There is no set meaning of these words. There are only contingent and transitory meanings of these words. And if you want to know what a word really means, you just look to how it's being used. I did that too, and I think that is good. I like Wittgenstein's idea, but I think the reason he came to that conclusion is he probably did what Gebser was trying to do, and try to find this one meaning for these root words, and he realized there is none. So there's no point of even bothering. Now, Wittgenstein deconstructed language a lot. I actually have found my conversations have improved ever since Wittgenstein. And no longer am I arguing over what real socialism or real capitalism or what this word really means. Sometimes I'll just make up a word and I'll say, if you want to call it capitalism, and then I just describe capitalism, we'll call it that. There's no need to slow the conversation down and bring it to a grinding halt because we have to have a semantic argument over what the true meaning of one word is. No, just assign it a meaning for this conversation and move on. Call it something else if you need to. So there you go. Thank you guys again. Next, we will be doing provisional statement of account, measure and mass. There's going to be some really great critiques of rationalism and it's some cultural criticism of the time. Really great stuff. Really biting and insightful stuff there. So thank you guys so much. This is another video. I was planning on this being only 25 minutes, but here we are. Thank you guys for continuing to watch. And as I said in the beginning of this video, thank you guys for commenting and engaging with me. I really appreciate that. So you guys are the best. I wish you all the best of luck in your life, whatever it is you're doing, and I will see you soon.